And we've made it to the end of chapter 3 in geometry. This is theorems about perpendicular lines. You should do 1 through 18 all, 19, 21, and 23. What can you conclude from the given information? State the reason. Let's see. Only a couple times do you have to state the reason. And here you just have to be able to draw conclusions to solve for x. And then when you're doing problems like this, sometimes I like to just start to fill in everything I know. And then in this case, you'll have to use the theorems to try to reach these conclusions. So let's see what the theorems are. And this is good practice. You're not allowed to just say Theorem 3.8. Now that's what the answer sheet is going to say, and I find that personally annoying because what does Theorem 3.8 say? It's nothing. And in another book it might be Theorem 2.7. So you really need to write it out, but I'm going to let you abbreviate as much as you want. And what Theorem 3.8 says, look, if I have a linear pair that's congruent, then the lines must be perpendicular. And remember what a linear pair is. It's a pair of angles that are adjacent that form a line. Well, if angle 1 is congruent to angle 2, the only way they can happen is if, a linear pair adds up to 180, and if these two angles are congruent, the only way that can happen is that each is 90, therefore J must be parallel to K. That's why it's a theorem, because you could go through that entire proof. Theorem 3.9, if two lines are perpendicular, then they form 4 right angles. So if I know J is perpendicular to K, then angles 1, 2, 3, and 4 must all be right angles. This is always one that I don't really know what the big deal is about that one, why I need to come to that conclusion, but it seems so obvious. But anyway, this is how you would abbreviate it. If two lines are perpendicular, then you get 4 right angles. So when those questions ask you to state a reason or provide justification, that's what you would have to write. What does Theorem 3.10 say? If the sides of adjacent angles, adjacent remember means next to, are perpendicular, then the angles are complementary. So really, if Viv was writing this, I wouldn't even put the rest of that. I would just say if sides, I would actually probably even just say if sides perpendicular, then angles are complementary. Sure, let's look at the sides of these adjacent angles. If AB is perpendicular, that would be given. If AB is perpendicular to AC, then the measure of angle 1 plus the measure of angle 2 must be 90. That's what it means to be complementary. Theorem 3.11 says, if a transversal is perpendicular to one of 2 parallel lines, then it must be perpendicular to the other. So here's my transversal L. It's perpendicular to one of 2 parallel lines. So what do I know? I know J is parallel to K, that was given, and I know that L is perpendicular to J. Well, what's my conclusion? Well, if these guys are parallel, and that's a 90, we know by corresponding angles that L must be perpendicular to K as well. And this is the whole thing about a theorem. If I know these things, then I can make this conclusion. Theorem 3.12 says if 2 lines are perpendicular to the same line, then they must be parallel. Again, this is how you would have to write it out. If 2 lines perpendicular to the same line, then they're parallel. So if I know that L is perpendicular to J and I know that K is perpendicular to J, I have 2 lines perpendicular to the same line, then L must be parallel to K. That's my conclusion. And then I just want to look at the worksheet and do number 22. These, you have to do several of these, 19, 21, and 23. So I have a line here, and I want to find the distance from point A to line C. Well, let's talk about it. If I have some line and point A is over here, how would you measure the distance from A to L? Or if this was you and you were running to the finish line, how would you run? You'd run perpendicular to that line C. You wouldn't run this way. So we measure perpendicularly, so I have to figure out what perpendicularly would be. Well, if I find the slope of this line, it's 3 over 1. So in this case, I want to go down 1 over 3, and then I use Pythagorean theorem. 1 squared plus 3 squared would equal d squared. 1 squared plus 3 squared would equal d squared. Even if my point were out here, then I would just have to do this again, right? Over 3 up 1. So, and then I would have 2, 6. But I'd still use Pythagorean theorem. 1 squared plus 3 squared is 10. So d squared equals 10. So d equals the square root of 10. That's how you'd go about doing that. Find the slope, draw the perpendicular, and then make your right triangle use Pythagorean theorem. That's how we find distance. You should go on and do the instructions if you haven't done them, do the writing assignment, and then start to get ready for the test because we're taking it right off when you get back. With 1 day to check in.